بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لطلبة الصف الثاني الثانوي العلمي. Math quiz on resultant of two forces acting on one point. First question, say if the two forces have the same line of action and the same direction, then R equals, choose one of the following: F1 plus F2, or vector F1 plus vector F2, or F1 minus F2, or absolute F1 minus F2. Question number 2. If the two forces have the same line of action and opposite direction, then R equals, choose one of the following answers: F1 plus F2, or absolute F1 minus F2, or F1 minus F2, or vector F1 minus F2. Questions number 3. The magnitudes of the minimum and the maximum magnitude of the resultant of the two forces of 5 and 8 Newton are, choose one of the following: -3 and -13, or 13 and -3, or 3 and 13, or -3 and 40. The next, two congruent forces at a point of magnitudes 5 and 3 Newton. Then the magnitude of their resultant are belongs. Choose one of the following answers: semi-open interval 2 and 8, open interval 2 and 8, closed interval 3 and 5, or closed interval 2 and 8. The next, two equal congruent forces at a point each of magnitude 6 Newton and their resultant 6 Newton. Then the measure of the angle between them equals 30 degrees, or 60 degrees, or 120 degrees, or 150 degrees. The next, two equal forces in magnitude and the measure of the angle between them 90 degrees. Magnitude of their resultant 6 Newton. Then magnitude of each of them equals 4 Newton, or 3 root 2 Newton, or 4 root 2 Newton, or 8 Newton. The next, the vector of the resultant of the two forces, vector F1 and vector F2, is equal to one of the following answers: vector R equals F1 plus vector F2, or R equals F1 plus F2, or vector R equals vector F1 minus F2 vector, or R equals absolute of F1 minus F2. The next, two forces of magnitudes 3n and 4n act on a particle, and the magnitude of their resultant is 5 Newton. Then the measure of the angle between them equals 30 degrees, or 90 degrees, or 45 degrees, or 60 degrees. The next, two forces of magnitudes 3 and F Newton, and the measure of the angle between them is 120 degrees. if the resultant is perpendicular to the first force, so the value of F is 1.5 Newton or 3 Newton or 6 Newton or 3 root 3 Newton. The next, if the two forces 6 Newton and 8 Newton are perpendicular, then the sign of the angle of inclination of their resultant with the first force equals 3 over 5 or 3 over 4 or 4 over 3 or 4 over 5. The next, the two forces 3F and 2F Newton act at a point and their resultant is the two forces 3F and 2F Newton act at a point and the resultant is 5F Newton. Then the measure of the angle between them equals 60 degrees or 20 degrees or 0 degrees or 180 degrees. The next, two forces of magnitudes 3 and 5 Newton act at a point and the measure of the angle between them is 60 degrees. Then the magnitude of their resultant equals 2 Newton, 7 Newton, 8 Newton or 5 Newton. The next, two forces of magnitudes 4 and F Newton act at a point and the measure of the angle between them is 120 degrees. If the line action of the resultant is perpendicular to the first force, then the magnitude of the resultant equals 4 root 3, 4 root 2, 4 or 4 root 5. Two forces are equal act at a point and the magnitude of their resultant is 3 Newton and the measure of the angle between them is pi over 3. Then the magnitude of each force is 3n, 3 over 2n, 3 root 3 n. Two forces of magnitudes 7 and F kilogram weight. If the resultant bisects the angle between them, then the value of F equals 8 kilogram weight, 7 kilogram weight, 10 kilogram weight, or 5 kilogram weight. The next, two forces of magnitudes 9 and 6 Newton, then the maximum value of their resultant equals 20n, 54n, 15n, or 3n. The next, two forces, the measure of the angle between them is theta. Then the magnitude of their resultant increase if theta increases, decreases if theta decreases, does not change whatever the value of theta, or increases if theta decreases. The next, two perpendicular forces of magnitudes 2F minus 5 and F plus 2 Newton and the magnitude of their resultant 3 root 5 Newton, then the value of F equals 7n, 6n, 4n, or 3 Newton. The next, two forces are equal in magnitude and each of them equal Fn. If the magnitude of the resultant is Fn, then the measure of the included angle equals 30 degrees, 120 degrees, 60 degrees, or 0 degrees. The next, if the magnitude of the resultant of two forces acting at a point reaches to its maximum value, then the measure of the included angle between the two forces equals 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 0 degrees,